So the second part here of chapter 2, just finishing up this chapter. So section 2.5 is looking at how to measure that nutritional status. So we're going to be learning about the ABCs essentially of that status. So finishing up, picking up from that malnutrition, under or overnutrition. So how to measure that nutritional status. So how do we determine if somebody's malnourished or undernourished or overnourished? So to find out essentially how nutritionally fit you are, there's a different assessment. And it's not just one factor. So this has to be performed by a primary care provider, usually with the aid of a dietitian. So if we look at these kind of ABCs, so the A stands for anthropometric assessment. This is going to be typically kind of what we think about as far as how we would measure it. So stepping on the scale, so determining that body weight, doing different measurements, so how tall we are, measuring our waist and hips and all that kind of stuff. That's typically what we think of, and that's certainly one part, but it's not the whole part of determining that nutritional status. So B stands for biochemical assessment, and this is where we get more into some deeper analysis. So this is looking at those the functions related to nutrient function. So concentrations of nutrient byproducts or enzyme activity would actually be measured in the blood or urine to see, we say somebody has a high metabolism or low metabolism or something like that. So these biochemical assessments can look at the different enzymes involved in nutrition and how active or inactive they may be. Then C stands for clinical assessment. So this is looking at that physical exam. So just one's general appearance as far as their skin, their eyes, even their tongue can indicate nutrition. Hair loss indicates under or malnutrition. Sensitivity to touch can indicate a change in nutritional status. Just the ability to cough and to walk indicates our fatigue or where we're at with that nutrition status. All right, then our D comes in with dietary assessment. So this is the estimation of a typical food choices. So this is relying on somebody recounting one's typical intake. Now, more and more there are apps that are out there that are tracking calories and that type of thing. But as far as this part of assessment, it's asking somebody to recall the last 24 hours of eating, keeping those diet records, and then answering different questionnaires about their food choices. Then the E stands for environmental assessment. So what are the living conditions like? What are the educational levels? How much information do they have about making healthy choices? What is their income as far as being able to buy healthy food? So the ability, to transport, but also to cook the food. So especially thinking about underdeveloped countries where, cooking stoves are not always something that they have. So how can they fix the food that's available to them? So again, thinking about a weekly budget for those food purchases. So limitations of this assessment. So a long time between the poor nutritional habits and the onset of the first clinical evidence. Again, it doesn't just happen overnight. This is long-term habits that happen. So diet high in animal saturated fats increase our blood cholesterol, but it takes a long time for that to become apparent before somebody would actually start maybe paying attention to that. Also, some of the clinical symptoms from some nutritional deficiencies. Instead of having too much of something, some of those that indicate not having enough nutrients would be diarrhea, so not getting enough fiber, inability to walk normal, or facial sores indicates a level of fatigue or a lack of vitamins or nutrients. All right, so then section 2.6, looking at those recommendations. So we're going to be looking at some different sources as far as what our nutritional guidelines should be. All right, so first of all, again, some acronyms that go along with this. So our dietary reference intakes is typically abbreviated DRY or DRY, so dietary reference intakes. So first of all, I have our recommended dietary allowance or RDA. Adequate intakes. This is mainly where we're going to kind of focus on the adequate intakes and recommended dietary allowances. But there are also a few that we'll mention here as well. Estimated energy requirements or EER, tolerable upper intake. So how much of something can we consume? So like what's the most amount of salt or the most amount of sugar? And then also the chronic disease risk reduction intakes. So again, relating some of those nutrients or foods to chronic disease. Again, we are mainly going to focus on these first two. All right, so the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance. So this nutrient intake, again, the majority meets the needs of about 98% of individuals. So it's not everybody, but it is the majority. So more than likely this applies to you. So an intake slightly above or below on any given day isn't a concern. We're talking about patterns of too much or too little over long periods of time, not just the occasional. Nutrient deviations below 70% or above about 3 times. This is where the RDA for an extended time, this can lead to those deficiencies or toxicities. So again, not just once or twice, we're talking about a significant amount, again, below 70% or about 3 times higher than what you should have. That's whenever those issues start to arise. All right, so this adequate intake, this is going to be for nutrient intake where there's really not as much information. So there's insufficient research to establish that recommended daily allowance. So instead, this is referred to as adequate intake. So it's based on estimates that appear to maintain a defined nutritional state or there's no apparent evidence of a nutritional deficiency related to that nutrient. Now, the estimated energy requirement, or EER, so this estimates the amount of energy or kilocalorie intake needed to match an average person, the energy that they would need at a specific stage in life. So that changes whether we're adolescents or adults. So that those needs are specific, taking into account, again, age, the biological sex, height, weight, and physical activity. So it's not the same for everybody. And it serves as a starting point for estimating those calorie needs. Then our tolerable upper intake level, or UL. This is the maximum chronic daily intake that is unlikely to cause adverse effects. So how much can you consume before you start having problems? And then problems start to arise for those who use many fortified foods and excess doses of vitamins and nutrients. That's whenever this can become a problem. And then the chronic disease risk reduction intake, CDRR. These are disease specific, so thinking about like heart disease or obesity or diabetes. So the target risk reduction for that chronic disease sets up the CDRR for that disease. So for example, the CDRR value for sodium is set because there's a link between that and the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. All right, so then the DV, or the daily value that's there. So this nutrient is the standard from the nutritional facts on our label. So the percent of the daily value is based on a 2,000 kilocalorie diet. Again, a lot of people may not need that many calories, so it needs to be, adjusted. So this is set at, or it's close to, the highest recommended daily allowance or related nutrient standard. There's set for vitamins, minerals, proteins, and other dietary components. And it allows intake comparisons between different foods. So if you're trying to pick which cereal to eat or which food to buy, these nutritional facts help compare those. So how should we use those standards? So they're intended for planning dietary patterns, and they're aimed at meeting that recommended daily allowance or the adequate intake. Again, for those that we don't have as much information on. And they're also set to not exceed the upper limits over a long period of time. All right, so then this is looking at what those labels, the information that they have on them, and how to use them for that planning. All right, so of course our nutritional labels, these are not new to us. First of all, there are different nutrient claims, so we'll kind of talk about those, like low sodium, low fat, that type of thing. Of course, the nutrients that are listed here, they appear on most labels that are there. For the most part, they kind of all look the same. There's also the quick guide, so our percent of the daily value. 20% is a rich source. If something has between 10 and 20, that's a good source. If it has 5 or less, that's a low source. So a rich source of calcium would be something that has more than 20% calcium, or 20% of the recommended daily value. Our servings per container, again, that's really important for thinking about that proportion. So again, same thing with the serving size. Again, percent daily value, how much of our daily value, again, these are based on those 2,000 kilocalorie diets. So if you don't need that much, then you kind of need to adjust what those percentages would be. Also thinking about added sugars and being able to identify those, and then the protein. Now the percent daily value is typically not given. It'll just list something like 7 grams of protein, and this is because it's expensive to test to determine that protein quality. So it's typically just listed as the amount, not the percent. Also, food allergens are typically labeled. So there was the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, due to the increased amount of allergies from foods that are being detected. So these food products that contain an ingredient that contains a protein of major food allergens are required to be labeled in one of two ways, either including the name of the food source in parentheses, following the common or usual name in the list of ingredients, or by just putting the word contains followed by the name of the food. So contains wheat, milk, eggs, etc. So now some of the health claims that can go on the food labels and their regulation. So health claims are regulated by the FDA. So, you know, it's one of the parts of the nutrition label. It is regulated by the Federal Drug Agency. Or the Food and Drug Agency. So what these are doing is they are monitoring and they're ensuring that what the claims are accurate. So they do have to be regulated. So the preliminary health claims, these are also regulated by the FDA, but the evidence may not be as rich, so it may be kind of limited. Then the nutrient claims, also closely regulated by the FDA. So again, low salt, low sugar, that kind of thing. And then the structure function. So these are not FDA approved or necessarily valid. And this is going to be more with like our supplements and that type of thing. When it's talking about like muscle building or something like that. So just increasing protein supplements doesn't necessarily mean that you're increasing muscle mass. So that's more of a claim, and those are not regulated by the FDA. So they can put that on their product without it necessarily being true. So some of the common nutrient claims that we see, sugar-free doesn't necessarily mean there's no sugar. It just means that there is less than 0.5 grams per serving. No added sugar, or without added sugar, or no sugar added. Those are all kind of the same thing. Again, doesn't mean there's no sugar in it. It just means that no sugar or sugar-containing ingredient was added during processing. So again, doesn't mean there's not any, it just wasn't added. And then reduced sugar means that at least 25% less sugar per serving than some other food. So it's comparing it to something else is where reduced sugar comes into play. Again, calorie-free doesn't necessarily mean there are no calories. It means that there is 5 kilocalories or less per serving. Low calorie is 40 kilocalories or less per serving. And then reduced or fewer calories, similar to what we had just seen, is less, at least 25% fewer. Again, it's in reference or comparison. So reduced sugar or reduced calorie means 25% less than another food source. Fat-free means, again, less than 0.5 grams, so similar to our sugar. Low fat is 3 grams or less per serving. Again, reduced or less, it means that there is at least 25% less compared to a reference food. Sodium, we either have sodium free, again, less than 5 milligrams, or low sodium. In this case, it's going to be 140 milligrams or less per serving is what constitutes low sodium. A few other things you may see on the labels. Enriched just means that during the processing, nutrients were lost. So again, enriched bread instead of whole grain bread. Enriched bread has less nutrients because during the processing of making it, nutrients were lost. Fortified means that nutrients were added that were not originally there. And then there are also healthy, so something that's labeled healthy. This is an individual food that is low fat, so it has low saturated fats. It has no more than 360 to 400 milligrams of sodium or 60 milligrams of cholesterol, and has at least 10% of the daily value of vitamin A, vitamin C, protein, calcium, iron, and fiber. So all of those have to be true for something to be listed as healthy. So it's not just looking at one thing, but it's looking at all of this: the saturated fats, the sodium, the cholesterol, and some of the vitamins, proteins, calcium, iron, or fiber. A few other things here. If something is listed as light, either way it's spelled, again, this is in reference, so it's a third fewer calories or half as much fat as the reference food. A good source, so if something says it's a good source of your daily calcium or good source of vitamin C, in order for that label to be on there, or that claim, it has to have at least 10 to 20 or 19% of the daily value for that nutrient. Again, like if something, an orange juice has 15% of the daily value in a serving, it could say it's a good source of vitamin C. And then if something says that it is high, it means that it has at least 20% or more of the daily value for that. All right, some of our other claims here. So if something is listed as diet, so especially beverages like Diet Coke or something like that, that's, in order for that, it means that it has dietetic, artificially sweetened, or it's sweetened with a non-nutritive sweetener. So again, only if the claim is not false or misleading can that be listed as that. So the food could also be listed as low calorie or reduced calorie. Again, good source. We kind of just mentioned this one, but again, 10 to 19% of the daily value comes for that. If it's 5 or less, it's a low source. And again, high is more than 20. Just some others that are listed. So organic, we see this a lot more. You might see a label something like this where it's USDA organic. This means that it's grown without the use of pesticides. There are no synthetic fertilizers, sewage sludge. It is not genetically modified. There's no ionizing radiation used. The meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy are from animals that are free of antibiotics or growth hormones. All of those have to be true for it to be labeled organic. on that. So at least 95% of the ingredients must meet those guidelines by weight. So again, the label would say made with organic ingredients if it only has 70% that's organic. So if it's labeled organic, it's 95% by weight of that. Otherwise, it'll say made with organic ingredients, indicating it has about 70% that are organic. And then so if something is listed as natural, that means the food is free of food colorings, artificial or synthetic flavors, or substances. So again, an apple that you just picked, that's natural for that. Would also just mention here, we'll talk about later, but organic doesn't always mean that it's healthier. So again, it's referring more to how it was raised or processed. Then with our meats, so a lean meat means that it has less than 10 grams of fat per serving, 4.5 grams of saturated fat, and 95 milligrams of cholesterol per serving. So it has to have less than all three of those, less than 10 grams of fat, less than 4.5 saturated, and less than 95 grams of cholesterol in order to be considered lean meat. Extra lean means that it has less than 5 grams of fat, 2 grams or less of saturated, and 95, so it's still the same there for the cholesterol. Again, reduced is at least 25% less compared to another product. And then low cholesterol would be 20 milligrams or less, and 2 grams or less of saturated fat per serving. Okay, so now looking at kind of wrapping up this chapter, looking at section 2.9, so just some eating well as a student, so things that consistently come up with college students. So the food choices, so those balanced meals typically get replaced by high fat, high calorie foods, convenience items, caffeinated beverages, trying to stay awake, just not having access to as healthy foods. So those dining halls, food trucks or fast food outlets, bars or vending machines. So again, that's thinking about those balanced options. So the temptation for convenience, taste, that leads to some typically unhealthy options and choices. So if we think about weight management as a student, we typically hear about the freshman 15. That describes the weight gain of students typically during their first year of college. Most do not actually gain 15 pounds. It's just, again, kind of a terminology that indicates most students do end up gaining weight during that first year. And that can be due to, again, changes in diet, but also an increased amount of heavy drinking, or whether or not they're working, things like that can impact that as well. So some reasons to maintain that healthy weight. So trying to lose weight gradually, again, instead of fad diets that just knock off a bunch of weight all at once. So it's a balancing act between calories in and calories burned. So again, healthy weight loss is about 1 to 2 pounds per week. So not trying to drop 5 pounds a week or something like that to fit into a dress or to look good, for something. But again, a slow, moderate amount of weight loss is preferred. So just a few things, some tips here to avoid that weight gain. Eating breakfast is very beneficial. So that protein, whole grain, and fruit is good. A lot of students or individuals in general skip breakfast. Limit the liquid calories. So again, drinking water, staying away from sugary drinks. Move around more, sit less, kind of plan ahead so that you can eat every few hours. Again, stock the fridge, get nutrient-dense snacks like nuts and things like that instead of potato chips or things like that. So again, making those healthy choices. Now kind of switching into some of the eating disorders. So up to 30% of college students are at risk for developing an eating disorder. So sometimes disordered eating may lead to an eating disorder. So these typically include anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder. So not necessarily a problem with the food and the nutrients that are being consumed, but rather it's an issue with self-esteem, depression, anxiety, and or abusive relationships. Also kind of thinking about moving more toward a plant-forward lifestyle. So many students choose vegetarian or vegan eating patterns. This becomes typically seen more in college students. So that can meet the nutritional needs and decrease the risk of chronic disease. But it does require appropriate planning to make sure all the nutrients are being obtained. So for optimal health benefits, again, choosing things that are baked, steamed, or stir-fried, not deep-fried or fried. Again, including those whole grain products and choosing foods that are fortified. So again, added vitamins and minerals to them. So then just thinking about some student athletes, if you know some or interact with some, or maybe you are one yourself, but a lot of college students compete, whether it's in intramural or intercollegiate athletics. So those muscles require adequate carbohydrates. We typically just think about proteins, but they need carbs to fuel those muscles as well as protein for growth and repair. Fat is an important source of that stored energy. We get more energy from fat than from carbohydrates, so it is important to consume those. Again, fluid is important, so replacing the water that gets lost and not being wooed by that supplemental industry. So there is so much out there about muscle, weight gain and bulk and all that kind of stuff. So, paying attention, being a critical thinker. And again, our nutrients should come from our food, not from supplements. So just kind of ending here. So some tips for eating well on a college student's budget as well. So if you're on campus using those prepaid meal plans, if you're off campus, planning ahead, if you're a commuter, not hitting McDonald's every day or something like that. So never go shopping on an empty stomach. That's forever, not just while you're in college, but there is a definite link there. So making sure you're not hungry when you're shopping. Have a list and stick to it, so that impulse buying, getting store brand foods rather than name brand helps save money. And then again, make use of those canned or frozen, even better yet, fruits and vegetables are good choices.